Historians have long debated one of the most disturbing mysteries of Tudor England. When did King Henry VIII begin to rot alive? Most assume his death was swift and regal, a monarch fading quietly in candlelight. But records and whispered accounts tell another story, one that reeks of sickness, fear, and slow decay. Among those who saw it happen was a young servant named Margaret Ashby. She was only 17 when she entered the royal kitchens of Whitehall Palace. To her family, it was an honor beyond dreams. To her, it became a nightmare she would never escape. Whitehall in the 1540s was a world of excess, a palace where the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine, mixed with the faint stench of rot beneath the walls. The king, once a symbol of vitality and power, had grown enormous, nearly 180 kilograms, his body failing under the weight of indulgence and rage. Margaret's duty was simple at first: carry food, clean tables, and serve in silence. But one winter morning, the chief housekeeper, Lady Cromwell, called her aside. Her voice trembled as she gave the order that would change the girl's life forever. "You will tend to the king's personal linen," she said. "And whatever you see, whatever you smell, must never leave this room." Margaret followed her down a narrow corridor, where the air turned heavy, a strange blend of perfume and decay. Each step deeper into the palace was a step closer to something unspeakable. When the door opened, the truth struck her like a blow. 4 maids stood inside, their faces wrapped in cloths, scraping at linen soaked in stains of yellow, brown, and green. The sheets were not merely dirty, they were rotting. And so, it seemed, was the man who slept in them. What began as an act of royal service would soon turn into an intimate witness to death, played out not in battle, but in the slow disintegration of a king's flesh. 4 weeks, Margaret said nothing. The work was unbearable, the smell, the weight of silence, the buckets of soiled linen. But the palace had its own laws. Servants who spoke too much simply disappeared. Each morning she and 4 other maids entered the royal chamber before dawn. They worked quickly, heads down, faces wrapped in cloth. The sheets were burned every few days, yet new ones always carried the same pattern. Dark stains, sticky residue, and, sometimes, fragments of skin. "It's his leg," whispered Sarah, the oldest maid. "The wound never heals. Each night, more of him stays behind." Historians now believe those wounds began nearly a decade earlier. In January 1536, the king fell from his horse during a joust. A massive, armored stallion crushed his body beneath the weight of steel. He was unconscious for 2 hours. When he awoke, something inside him had changed. Modern doctors suspect a traumatic brain injury, and perhaps Cushing's syndrome, a disorder that explains his weight gain, rages, and chronic ulcers. But in his own court, to suggest the king was unwell was to invite death. So the ulcers deepened, the fever grew, and the palace began to rot from the inside out. Margaret soon learned the rhythm of decay. 3 times a day, the king's chambers were scrubbed and perfumed. Even so, guests fainted in his presence. His bandages had to be changed every few hours, each one soaked with pus, dripping as they were carried away. Dozens of pounds of fabric burned every week, a secret fire no one dared question. And there were other humiliations. By his later years, the king could no longer walk without assistance or control his bowels. He traveled with a special chair, designed to catch what his body could no longer contain. Yet still, his word was law. Power had not abandoned him, but reason had. He slept surrounded by guards and weapons, crossbows, daggers, and pistols laid beside his bed. He trusted no one. Even the food that entered his chamber passed through layers of inspection, tasting, and superstition. Witnesses described him as a man trapped inside his own fortress, a body of rotting flesh. Guarded by fear itself, Henry's obsession with poison bordered on madness. He built sealed kitchens guarded by soldiers, forbade his servants from touching his food, and required each taster to wait 30 minutes before he ate. He even installed secret passages throughout his palaces, escape routes for an enemy that never came. And he ordered magical eyes carved into walls and doors so that he could spy on his own courtiers. Spies watched spies. Informants watched informants. Until everyone in Whitehall feared even the sound of their own breathing. For all his power and appetite, the people who suffered most under Henry VIII were not his enemies, but his wives. History remembers them as names in a rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But behind those words lies a level of psychological cruelty that makes even the most violent rulers seem merciful. Anne Boleyn, the spirited queen who dared to challenge the king, was not merely executed, she was broken. Before her death, Henry orchestrated a theatre of humiliation so twisted, it could only come from paranoia. He accused her of adultery with 5 men, one of them her own brother. Each was tortured into false confessions, and then Henry forced Anne to watch, as every one of them was executed in turn. She stood there, trembling, knowing she was next, her husband watching with calm indifference. Then came Catherine Howard, barely 17 when she became queen. She was vivacious, naive, and doomed from the start. When Henry learned of her past, he didn't just end her life. He rewrote the law itself, declaring it treason for anyone to marry the king, without confessing every detail of their sexual history. A man so petty, he changed the legal system of England to punish a teenage girl. For not being the virgin, he demanded. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, spent her last years isolated and sick. She was forbidden to see her daughter Mary, while Henry spread rumors that she had gone mad. She died alone, writing letters of forgiveness he never read. James Seymour, the one history calls the lucky one, died giving birth to his only son. Henry waited just 9 days after her funeral, before planning his next marriage, and Anne of Cleves, a foreign princess chosen for alliance, was so terrified of Henry that she signed an annulment agreement. Declaring she was grateful not to be executed, she thanked him for sparing her life. 6 wives, 2 executed, 4 destroyed in quieter ways. Each was promised love and glory, and each learned what it meant to be trapped in a palace, where affection could turn to death overnight. Henry alternated between gifts and terror, a diamond one morning, a death sentence the next. It wasn't only his body that decayed. It was his capacity to love, to trust, to be human. The rot that consumed his flesh had already claimed his heart. By 1544, Henry VIII was not merely a sick man. He was an empire of fear, a body and a kingdom, slowly collapsing under the same disease. By 1544, Henry VIII was more carcass than king. He weighed nearly 400 pounds. His waist measured 54 inches, and his legs, swollen, ulcerated, and covered in bleeding sores, had become a symbol of his decay. Yet no one dared speak the truth. To question the king's health was treason. Even his doctors pretended hope. And so Margaret continued to wash his sheets, day after day, night after night, until the day the smell changed. It was March 1545. The morning air was unusually cold. Margaret entered the chamber and stopped. The odor was not the same as before. It was sweeter, thicker, the unmistakable scent of death. 2 of the maids ran out. 1 fainted. Only Margaret and Elizabeth remained. When they lifted the sheets, they saw what no servant should ever see. The bandages on the king's left leg had loosened. Beneath them, the flesh was black, peeling away from the bone like overcooked meat. Tiny white larvae moved in the open wound. Gangrene. The King of England was rotting alive. Elizabeth whispered, "He won't live long." But she was wrong. The body that should have died refused to stop breathing. For 2 more years, Henry VIII raged and ruled, and a walking corpse seated on a throne of gold. By 1546, the king could no longer stand. Servants lifted him with ropes and pulleys, moving his massive frame from bed to chair. His ulcers had grown so infected that pieces of him fell to the floor. As they carried him through the corridors, servants followed behind with cloths, collecting the fragments that dropped. Margaret once found a toe, black, hardened, already dead. She held it in her hand and began to laugh, until another maid slapped her to silence. "How can he still be alive?" she whispered. No one answered. Henry's death came in the early hours of January 28th, 1547. By then, his body was grotesquely swollen, his skin stretched tight and shining, like leather filled with air. Even his physicians couldn't bear the smell. They left the room to vomit. When his breathing finally stopped, no one approached the bed. No one wanted to see what death had done. They sealed the corpse in lead-lined coffins, layered wood upon metal, believing the weight would contain the corruption. But during the long procession to Windsor, the inevitable happened. The coffin burst. Gas, pressure, and decay ripped the seams apart. Royal remains spilled inside the carriage. The stench filled the air. The procession halted. Servants rushed with buckets and cloths to clean what was left of their king. Witnesses claimed that dogs came running and licked what had fallen onto the road. The man who ruled by divine right ended as food for strays. Even his burial was chaos. The coffin was too large for the grave. The soil collapsed beneath its weight, forcing workers to widen the pit again and again. It took hours to lower the King of England into the ground. For years afterward, visitors claimed they could smell death. Lingering near his tomb, a faint sweetness, like rot beneath marble. Historians would later call him a reformer, a tyrant, a visionary. But to the servants who saw his final days, Henry VIII was something else entirely, a man consumed by his own excess. Many of those who handled his body died within weeks, their lungs blackened by infection. Margaret Ashby survived, but her nights were never quiet again. Even decades later, she told neighbors that sometimes she woke in darkness and swore she could smell him, the king who refused to die. So when did Henry VIII begin to rot alive? Perhaps in 1536, after that fall from his horse. But when did he cease to be a man? In March of 1545, when death moved into his flesh and refused to leave. For 2 more years, England was ruled by a zombie, a man who devoured whole feasts, while his own body fell apart. They said his reign ended with glory. But history remembers something different, the sound of a bursting coffin, and the dogs that came to finish the feast. If this tale stirred your blood or chilled your bones, kneel before the throne and click subscribe. Your loyalty will not be forgotten.